apologize. At first, my first language is not English, it's Danish. And I know when I speak foreign languages, I get this really grumpy look on my face, which is a real issue when you're a happiness researcher. Because if I don't look happy, I get fired, okay? But yeah, I'm from the Happiness Research Institute. We are a think tank based in Copenhagen. And basically, I'm interested in answering 3 questions. First, how do we measure happiness? Second, why are some people happier than others? And ultimately, we hope to find out how do we improve quality of life. So that's what my career is about. Once I solve those 3 questions, I can retire. Unfortunately, that's not going to be anytime soon. They're quite difficult questions. I'll address some of them here today. We have about 30 minutes or so. I'm sure there will also be time for questions around hygge in the end. Another thing, when you work with happiness research, people often imagine that my office looks somewhat like this, and like here, people handing around ice cream and coffee. It's not the case. It looks more like this. We work a lot with numbers and statistics and data. Those 3 questions I talked about before, we're trying to solve from a scientific point of view. Okay? We work for foundations, cities, governments, companies, trying to find ways to improve quality of life. And there's a lot of really exciting things happening these years when it comes to politics and happiness research. We see more and more governments embracing happiness as the new metric. Back in 2011, the UN passed the Happiness Resolution, encouraging all countries to focus more on happiness and see what they can do to improve quality of life. And we see different cities and governments now measuring their progress as societies, not just in terms of GDP or standard of living, but also in quality of life. One of the most recent interesting initiatives actually comes out of the Middle East, where the United Arab Emirates, one of the richest countries in the world, also the country with the tallest building in the world, now want to be one of the happiest countries in the world. So Uhud here on the left, her job is to get the Emirates to one of the 5 happiest countries by 2021. So she has a big task in front of her. There's trouble with measuring happiness. Tara has one perception of what happiness is. Steve has another one. I have a third. And the first thing we need to do when we address happiness, well-being, or quality of life is to acknowledge that those are umbrella terms. We read different things into them. So what we do when we stumble upon these umbrella terms is that we tear them apart, right? We look at the different components and look at the different elements. When we talk about the economy, we also look at different indicators. We talk about growth, we talk about inflation, we talk about unemployment rates, interest rates. And those terms gives us a language to talk about the economy. And we need to do the same thing when it comes to happiness. Tear it apart and look at the different elements. We also do it with trivial things like the weather. We have names for the different indicators when we talk about the weather. So when we talk about happiness, we need to look at least 3 different dimensions of happiness. Use those terms to capture exactly what it is we are talking about, so we have a unified language. And first, we need to measure life satisfaction, or cognitive happiness. It is basically an exercise where we ask people to take a step back and evaluate their lives. How happy are you with your life overall? Sometimes we'll use questions like this one. Imagine a ladder with the worst possible life you could lead at the bottom, the best possible life you could lead at the top. Where do you feel you stand right now on a scale from 0 to 10? Take a second to think what you would answer. odds are you would probably answer the same thing 2 weeks from now. What we see is it's quite a stable measure of happiness. It's also the dimension that people, or that the UN use in their World Happiness Report. It's different from what we call the affective dimension of happiness. That is much more about what kind of emotion we feel at a given point in time. So if you take yesterday, what kind of emotions did you experience there? Probably suspense, maybe loneliness, anger, resentment, maybe joy, maybe happiness. We see that dimension is much more volatile. We can detect actually a weekend effect on this dimension. And of course, these two dimensions are also linked. If you have an everyday with a lot of positive emotions, you probably also report higher levels of life satisfaction. We get a lot of data on both these dimensions. In the UK, we actually have a great project going on under the London School of Economics. They have now collected more than 3 million responses from people all over the UK, asking them up to 3 times a day, how happy are you? But also, who are you with? What are you doing? Where are you? I had a jealous ex-girlfriend who used to write me the same things. She didn't collect the data, though. But the interesting things are, once you start to compile those data, you suddenly get some patterns. Now you can start to see what is the most miserable activity that people do in the UK. No big surprise, they're home, in bed, they're ill. Any guesses on what's the second most unhappy activity, where that takes place? Queuing, work, yes. Work, unfortunately, is number 2. Maybe there's something we can change there. We can also see Christmas Day, usually the happiest day. Any guesses on what the most unhappy day was last year, 2016? The Brexit referendum. It's a good bet, but remember, part of the country voted to leave. No, it was actually November 9th, right? The morning we woke up and this guy was president. Same goes for me. Not only did I wake up and he was president-elect, I also lost my laptop with a chapter for a new book I had not saved anywhere else. I got it back, it's fine. But the point was, it was a really shitty morning for me, but I was still quite happy with my life overall. And that's why we need to separate those two factors. Now, the third factor we always include in our surveys as well is based on Aristotle's perception of happiness or the good life. And to him, the good life was the meaningful life. So do people have a sense of purpose? And here we can see, especially having kids, have a tremendous positive effect on that dimension. On the other two, mixed results. We'll get back to that later on. So what we do when we have these 3 dimensions solved, ideally, we follow people over time. Not in a sort of creepy, stalky kind of way, but following you and 10,000 other people from the UK, we can see over the next decade, some people are going to win the Nudge Awards, some people are going to get promotions, some people are going to lose their jobs, get married, get divorced, and so on. And our job is to understand how those changes in your life circumstances affect these different dimensions of happiness. So that's our job. And we use methods we know from medicine. In Denmark, we've been interested in understanding why is it that people in one county live 5 years longer than another county. We've looked at behavior that explains the differences in the life expectancy or the differences in longevity. And of course, we find that the behavior in terms of diet, exercise, alcohol, and smoking explains the differences. So my job is to take the same methods and apply them to happiness research or happiness data. So when we look at millions of responses from around the world, what are the factors that explain why people in the Nordic countries often lie at the top of the list, and countries like Syria and Burundi lie at the bottom of the list? That's my job. And what we find is that we can actually explain it with quite few factors. And I'll go through them in a second. But, as mentioned, the Nordic countries often do well. Switzerland, the Netherlands, Canada, Australia are also usually in the top 10. These are the 5 World Happiness Reports that have been sent out of the UN in the past years. Usually Denmark just comes in a little ahead of the other countries. And of course that enables some companies to use that. This is the ad that will greet you in Copenhagen airport, even though now Norway is in first place. But of course Carlsberg is not the only company that uses happiness in their advertising. You can open happiness, you can have a happy period, you can live happily. So we see this all the time, sometimes in a very explicit manner, but it's always there. And it's always there because it is the ultimate goal for people to become happy. Or to use a more contemporary philosopher, advertising about one thing, right? So let's look at the reasons why some people are happier than others. No big surprise, we can see that health matters. This is a study we did with a company called Leo Innovation Lab, where we have looked at how a skin disease called psoriasis impacts happiness for people. And what we find is, no big surprise, in Denmark, if you have this disease, you are less happy than the average Dane. You're 12% less happy. What we find is that that happiness gap varies between different countries. In the US, we find the happiness gap to be 20% instead of 12%. It's the same disease, but maybe it's because there is lack of universal health care. So yes, health matters. That's also why, when we look at the Nordic countries, part of the reason why they do well in the happiness rankings is that they have long life expectancy. And in part, they have that because all the Nordic countries have really high exercise levels. And why do the Nordic countries have high exercise levels? It's not because we love the gym. Nobody loves the gym. It's because we don't think of exercise as exercise. In our daily commute, exercise is built in. We think of it as transportation. This is my morning commute. Sometimes you don't cross in the first green wave. And of course, if you have a system that every day builds in exercise, you get more on the daily basis. Secondly, we see that people who are free to choose their course in life are obviously happier. In the Nordic countries, you have all the classic rights: freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. You have marriage equality. You're free to marry whoever you want, as long as that other person says yes, of course. Otherwise, me and Rachel Weisz would be a thing. And we also see that there's a lot of freedom when it comes to our time use. That's especially something that people from the UK mention when they come to work in Copenhagen, that suddenly there is a better work-life balance. People leave the office at 4 or 5 because they have to pick up the kids. There's a culture around that. There is a fundamental different approach to time. And I think it's really interesting to see how the infrastructure around families, the family-friendly policies, affect our behavior in that way and also affect our happiness levels. It comes into play when we see the relationship between happiness and age. So this is the usual curve we see when it comes to happiness and age, globally. We're usually happiest when we're young and when we're old. I'm heading downhill these years. I also have some bad news. It's not just that we get happier as we get old, because one of the reasons why the average increases over time is that happiness keeps people healthy, meaning that the unhappy ones die off, and that increases the average. So that's the bad news. But I think it's super interesting to see this is the universal curve we usually find, when it comes to life satisfaction, this is what we usually find in the Nordic countries. We don't have the same drop midlife. The reason why there is this drop midlife is usually because there's a lot of pressure on people these years. You want to have an interesting career. You also want to have a somewhat healthy work-life balance and take care of your family. If you have family-friendly policies, if you have the opportunity to leave the office in the afternoon to pick up your kids, you don't feel the same level of stress that reduces your life satisfaction. Earlier, I said kids were a good thing when it comes to sense of purpose, sense of meaning. When it comes to life satisfaction, depends on many things. But in a lot of countries, we see that people with kids are less happy than non-parents, people without kids. But the interesting thing is to see how that gap varies. And here are the results. Here we have US. Parents are 12% less happy than non-parents. UK, around 8%. Denmark, minus 2%. But in Sweden and Norway, that have even better family-friendly policies than Denmark, parents are happier than non-parents. And interestingly, Portugal, Spain are at the top of the list. Parents are much happier than non-parents, probably because they have a better coherent family structure. Not only do you have 2 parents, but you have 4 grandparents. That gives the parents more freedom. That's why the parents are happier in those countries. We also see, of course, having freedom at work matters, not just in terms of job satisfaction, but also in terms of life satisfaction. Having the opportunity to work from home or having autonomy at work affects job and life satisfaction. And it doesn't only have to be, autonomy. It can also be how we experience freedom when we are at work. Imagine you have 4 hours. Every Tuesday morning, 4 hours with no meetings scheduled, no phone calls, no mails coming in, no managers asking for progress reports. 4 hours of freedom to do what you want to do, work on what you need to work on. How many would like that? I call that a majority. Actually, companies are doing that. We see Intel having introduced the term they called Tuesday morning quiet time. We actually also tried it at the Happiness Research Institute. For us, it didn't work with 4 hours on Tuesdays. We have 2 zones per day now. We call it creative productive time. 1 hour and a half in the morning, 1 hour and a half in the afternoon, where I know I won't get interrupted. We call it something, so people respect it. Right? We give it a name. Thirdly, we know that wealth matters when it comes to happiness. We see, on average, richer people are happier. I'm sorry. It's only in Hollywood movies and pop songs that money doesn't matter for happiness. But here we have 50,000 Europeans, high income, low income, happiness upwards. But I think the important takeaway here is when money matters. Money matters when we are low income and go up to middle income. The marginal impact from going to middle income to high income is quite small. Because being without money is a cause of unhappiness, right? The first money we get, we spend on food, roof over our heads, put our kids to school. If we already have £1 million, we spend money on Serenity dog pods. That is not a happy dog, right? So of course, with everything else, there's a diminishing marginal utility also from money, right? And I think we have probably reached, for a lot of areas, peak stuff for happiness, or peak happiness for stuff. I'm sorry to say this in this room, but I think a lot of us have not just reached the summit, I think they've fallen off the cliff, and the dog is taking a dump on the summit. That's what happened. So, that is a key challenge, not just for people, but for countries as well. How do we get additional well-being or quality of life or happiness out of additional wealth? Just to give you a concrete example, and I think that's the poster child of that challenge for a lot of people, a feeling that we have gotten richer without getting happier. South Korea have gone from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest countries in about 60 years. I was there in November. It looks like this. Coming back to Copenhagen feels coming back to a third world country. Standard of living, really high. Trouble is, they've failed to convert that wealth into well-being. The suicide levels are the highest in OECD, the second highest in the world. You have UK here, you have Denmark here. They're really struggling with using the money they have, the wealth they've created, to create quality of life for their people. A lot of competition, a lot of stress, and talents are fleeing the country, basically to have dinner with their families. So this is the key challenge that I think countries need to solve, that companies need to solve. How do we take the money that we have created, the growth that we create, and turn it into quality of life? The country that solves that will be the most successful country. The city that solves it will be the most successful. There are reasons why we become happier, or why we don't become happier when we become richer, both as a country and as a people. One of the reasons is what we call hedonic adaptation, or the hedonic treadmill. The mechanism here is that we constantly raise the bar for what we feel we need in order to be happy. Keeps going up. We always want more. I think it was also Don Draper that says, happiness is the moment before you want more happiness, right? Another reason is we constantly make social comparisons. How many of you would like this car? A couple? Okay. 2? Well, how happy would we be with this car? I would be pretty happy. I don't have a car. It looks nice. But if the neighbor suddenly drives up in this one, I'd probably be less satisfied with the car I had before. And that's what we see. We see an arms race when it comes to wealth, when it comes to success, when it comes to health, when it comes to beauty. We are constantly raising the bar also against each other. We care not only about absolute income, so our ability to consume, but our relative income. So how much money do I make compared to everybody else? And we do that because we care about social comparisons, or our position in the social hierarchy, right? That is also why we love and hate social media. We actually did an experiment 2 years ago at the Happiness Research Institute on this. Because social media is this constant bombardment of great news that happens for everybody else, right? So every time I logged on, there's this guy, getting married, beautiful wife, going on a wonderful honeymoon, doing an Ironman, moving into a new flat. Same guy on the same day, right? It's a real tough contrast to compare my life against when I'm having leftovers again. So we looked at being without Facebook. How does that affect people's well-being on different dimensions? So we had 1,000 people sign up, and we ran our happiness surveys on them, and then randomized them into 2 groups, and then looked after 1 week, how happy are people now? And we found, actually quite surprising, an increase in life satisfaction, but also in terms of lower levels of anxiety and stress. I'm sure all those people are back on Facebook now. So there must be something there that attracts us. Of course, we get a little kick, and we're also really curious to see what other people are doing. But it's a great vehicle for social positioning. But it probably also has some issues in terms of our life satisfaction. What we see is also, in Denmark, boarding schools increasingly helping the students create communities outside the digital community. So you have schools where, in the beginning of the semester, all the devices are taken from the kids. The smartphones, the iPads, everything. And then the kids can have their devices 1 hour per day, where they can Snapchat and Heyday and whatever they do. But for 23 of the hours, they're forced to have a community together. All right? Then after 6 months, it's put to a vote. Would you prefer this system, or would you like to keep the system where you only have your phone 1 hour per day, or would you go back to having your phones and your devices all the time you want? And 80% vote for the current system, to be without the phones, because they realize that we actually get a community when we're not on our phones. And I think a lot of families and streets are experimenting with these things, trying to create these critical masses for analog play. Could we say on Thursday, on our street, it's analog night? So we send our kids out to play, like you used to do when you were kids. I think there are some interesting ways to try to tackle the online communities in this way. So we don't have time to go into the other three factors, but just very briefly, we see that trusting populations are on average happier. Also, and I think this was mentioned earlier today, generosity, altruism has an effect on happiness. But most importantly, it seems that social support is the best predictor of whether people are happy or not. Do we have somebody in our life we can rely on in times of need? But yeah, I think this is the key challenge for people like you and people like me. How do we help people convert wealth into well-being? This is one of the experiments we'll do this fall, where we will basically hand out money to people. It's been very easy to get people to sign up for this experiment. But we'll see how we can best invest our resources in creating well-being, both here and now, but also in terms of life satisfaction. So I very much look forward to that experiment. What our expectations are is that money is best spent if we purchase activities and experiences that are meaningful to us and that connects us with other people. So for me, for instance, because I work with happiness research, and because Bhutan, a small country in the eastern Himalayas that have been using a concept called gross national happiness for the past 40 years, for me, it would make a lot of sense to purchase a trip there together with my girlfriend, for instance, because I would get a lot of meaning, I would get a lot of connection, I would get a lot of experience out of that. But this is the key question that we need to solve. And now it's time for questions.
Congratulations on doing so well in Denmark, despite what seems to me, from my television viewing, an alarmingly high murder rate, usually in a dimly lit underground car park. This is actually a fair point, which is, it is true to say this is actually true that the Danish are unbelievably heavy beer drinkers. Is that not right?
I think there's some truth in that, but there is a station they've missed. You know, it's countries with a good work-life balance that allows for time to go get pissed. That I happen.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Very good question at the bottom. Is
the genetic one?
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a certain proportion? Is there a certain proportion that is genetically pre-wired? I have read some research that
there is really interesting twin studies coming out of the US, actually from the University of Minnesota have a twin register from times where it was allowed for two different couples to adopt one twin each. So you can have identical twins that are raised separately. And what we see from those studies is that genetics matter. Identical twins have fairly similar happiness levels. Non-identical twins don't. The only trouble with that study is all the kids are raised in the same country.
Yes.
Ideally, we would want twins, separated at birth and then brought up in different countries. But the government say I can't do that.
Yeah, quite exporting children is still slightly out of fashion. Yeah. No, a few other questions. You can't help noticing that. Okay, it's popped up again. Is there a danger? I have read also that you should pursue happiness obliquely, and that the very act of consciously trying to be happy is actually less successful as a strategy than finding happiness as a byproduct.
Yeah. So there is the saying, ask yourself if you're happy, and you cease to be so. And happiness should probably best be found as a byproduct. So that's the personal level. I think from a company, country, city point of view, I think it's a good thing, because we know that what we measure matters. If you and I, we put on pedometers, we start to walk more automatically because we're interested in numbers. So what we measure matters, and that's why our position is that we should then measure what matters to people, and life satisfaction does.
Very interesting. There is this question that many... what have you got this one? Great art. I mean, there is a question, what's so great about happiness? I mean, Nassim Taleb asked me, I was sitting in the audience with a presentation, and he said, it isn't actually a sensible aim, despite what Aristotle might have said, and that actually some degree of unhappiness or difficulty, certainly in terms of your perception of life achievement, may actually be helpful. The idea that you should aim to be constantly happy is a dangerous one.
Yeah.
And that the overcoming of difficulties.
Yeah. I mean, people can be as unhappy as they wish. That's not our aim. And in any given life, there's going to be misery and unhappiness. I think that's part of the journey that we all face. Our mission is to create the best possible conditions for people to have good lives within. That's what we're interested in.
There's also an interesting thing I've noticed in my visits to Scandinavian countries, which is that generally conspicuous consumption is slightly more frowned on.
Yeah.
Now, I've noticed that, by the way, if you have really, really rich Danish friends, their house in Copenhagen is extremely elegant but quite modest. You then discover they have a massive blingy villa in Italy with a gold-lined swimming pool, but you can't have that in Denmark.
Right.
Because it's essentially frowned on as kind of Lutheran aberration.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's called the law of Jansen. It's basically the tall poppy syndrome, I think your expression is. And it's true, conspicuous consumption is frowned upon, which, I mean, it has some bad sides because, taking pride in your success and excellence is frowned upon, and that sort of put a curb on hard work or accomplishment. But in terms of limiting blinginess on the streets, I actually think it's a good thing. You won't see a lot of flashy cars, and you won't see a lot of sort of extravagant social status markers in that sense.
And I suppose you're also characterized, although that may not apply to Australia so much, with relatively high levels of wealth redistribution, which I suppose, given the diminishing marginal utility seen on the graph, having said that, that probably doesn't apply to Australia or Canada quite so much.
Yeah.
But Norway a lot, I guess.
Yeah. So on average, we see more equal societies are on average happier. And you can also, I mean, a lot of journalists will say, how can you be so happy? You pay some of the highest taxes in the world, right? Yeah. I pay 52% of my income in taxes. But I, together with 9 out of 10 Danes, say we're happily paying our taxes. Because I don't think we see them as taxes, we see them as investments in quality of life.
Do you hear this? There are people from HMRC here. I just thought I'd make that point. That's very interesting.
But, I think what works in the Nordic countries is that we have removed the price tag on happiness. Because whether you're at the bottom or the top of the economic pyramid, you will still have a relatively good life. So there's less to compete for, but there's also less to be anxious for. Even if because I look grumpy today, I'll lose my job tomorrow, but I can still experience fairly the same level of quality of life tomorrow as I can today, even if I lost all my income. And that gives a lot of peace of mind. So removing that price tag and decoupling the link between wealth and well-being, I think that's what works in the Nordic countries. We elevate the bottom, that brings up the average, but it also brings up the quality of life for the richest part of the population.
You think there's I mean, it's a very interesting question, this, but you do think there is a small price to be paid in terms of lack of entrepreneurialism, in that life is so pleasant at a relatively low level of effort?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sad to see we have relatively low numbers of entrepreneurship.
Yes.
Because the gains are perhaps not that great. There's really low risks in venturing out into entrepreneurship because there's a social security net that will pick you up if you fall.
Yeah.
But, if you make 10 million, you have to work really hard for it, and you still have a really decent life, a very good life, for a lot less income.
There was a question actually earlier. I don't know if you have a view on this. It's disappeared now. But do you think the guaranteed basic income would be net happiness enhancing or not?
Yes.
Interesting.
I'm really interested in looking at the experiments they've set or started in Finland. I mean, what we see when we follow people over time, one of the worst things that can happen, even beyond divorce, is people losing their jobs. And of course, one thing is losing our income, but we also lose sort of our relationships, our social circles. A lot of our social relationships is through work. We also lose our identity. And there's a lot of stigma around unemployment. And we can see, no big surprise, there is a higher risk from suicide if you're unemployed. But that risk is higher if you are in an area with low unemployment, because you are the odd one out. There's a social stigma around it. So I think if we create a society where you are guaranteed a basic income, we will remove some of that stigma there is around being unemployed.
The identity thing is interesting, because one of the most interesting findings I read is that when you reach retirement age as an unemployed German plumber, okay, your level of happiness, your level of wealth doesn't change at all. You just become a retired plumber rather than an unemployed plumber with pretty much the same money. But weirdly, when you can rebrand yourself as retired rather than unemployed, your level of happiness absolutely rockets. Yeah. Equivalent, I think, to a level of being a newlywed. Admittedly, that might be newlywed to
that's in Germany,
which may be lower. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But nonetheless, that strikes me as an extraordinary, importance of personal branding. That just by now being a retired something or other, rather than an unemployed something or other, your level of happiness skyrockets. Seems extraordinary.
Yeah, but it's true, and the marriage effect is an interesting one, and actually one we've been looking at.
Because people are asking about your relationship, Stacey. I don't know how self-interested. That was Tara, actually, who's asking. Behind you. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
I'm not married, but I have a girlfriend.
Right, yeah. That's very clear. Thank you.
But when it comes to marriage, we can see that married people are happier. But of course, we've been questioning ourselves, do you get happy from marriage, or is it the other way around?
Happy people get married.
Exactly. So again, we follow people over time. And we see actually both things are true. There is the effect that, on average, happier people have a bigger chance of getting married. But we also see that when people get married, there is an increase in their life satisfaction. Then it sort of slowly sets over time. Yeah, but both things are actually true. Yeah.
So, I mean, the last thing, I suppose. Sorry. Okay, I'll leave it. We'll all ask questions afterwards. You're here for the rest of the afternoon,
yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Mike. That's absolutely